Good evening and welcome to tonight's event. As Brian said, my name is Jason Alexander. I'm a professor in the Department of Philosophy, Logic, and Scientific Method here at the London School of Economics and Political Science, and I'll be the chair for tonight's event. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to this evening lecture by Dr. Alexander Schaefer, Assistant Professor of Philosophy at the University of Buffalo. Dr. Schaefer's work lies at the fascinating intersection of political philosophy, social complexity theory, and social contract theory. His research has been published in prestigious journals, including the American Journal of Political Science, the Cambridge Journal of Economics, Economics and Philosophy, and Social Theory and Practice, among others. Tonight, Dr. Schaefer asks us to reconsider a fundamental tension within liberal thought, one that has profound implications for our understanding of justice, social progress, and the very nature of liberalism itself. While many contemporary liberals emphasize cohesion and stability as paramount values, Dr. Schaefer argues that this represents a significant departure from an essential tradition in 20th century liberal thought. This tradition, championed by thinkers such as John Stuart Mill, John Dewey, Karl Popper, and F.A. Hayek, embraced not stability, but dynamism as the hallmark of a thriving liberal society. For these thinkers, liberalism was not a static endpoint, but an ongoing process, one that extended beyond economic and political institutions to encompass the continual reappraisal and potential revision of our moral beliefs and social practices. They celebrated the open society precisely for its capacity to adapt, develop, and progress. Dr. Schaefer's work on social complexity theory offers a particularly rich lens through which to explore these ideas. His award-winning paper, Is Justice a Fixed Point?, challenges traditional approaches to justice that fail to account for the dynamic nature of social moral systems. Tonight's lecture represents an ambitious attempt to resurrect this dynamic tradition in liberal theory and to offer a compelling alternative to the static analysis that has dominated Rawlsian liberalism in recent decades. As Brian noted, today's event will proceed as follows. Dr. Schaefer will speak for approximately 1 hour, and then we'll open it up for questions afterwards. Please join me in giving a warm LSE welcome to Dr. Alexander Schaefer.
Is the mic going to pick up my voice from here? Great. Thank you so much. That was a really kind introduction, and thank you, Brian, for organizing this, and thank you to all of you for being here. I'm especially thankful for the opportunity to leave a fairly chaotic political climate in the United States and have a few days of fresh air. We're in the second term now of Donald Trump, and although this is an American problem, it's not just an American problem, right? This is a global phenomenon of the rise of authoritarian populism. Hasn't been a good couple decades, in fact, for people who like civil liberties and political liberties. Freedom House, which ranks the sort of degree to which countries support civil liberties and political liberties, finds that over the last 19 years, we've just seen constant declines in global freedom, meaning that more countries have become less free than more free. In fact, the last time we had a year where more countries became more free was in 2005. So, you know, us liberals should be asking, and I'm assuming that most people are liberals of some sort or another in this room, though if you're not, that's fine. But I think it's a safe assumption in this sort of environment. We should be asking ourselves why this is happening. What are the causes of this decline? Because 19 years straight is not good. And that's a complex question. There's obviously going to be multiple factors driving that, and it's probably going to vary from country to country. But a slightly more tractable question that might help us get a grip on this is, why did Donald Trump win in 2024? And that question is slightly easier to answer. We have survey data that suggests that there were essentially three top reasons why this was occurring. So this is data from Blueprint, which is an opinion research group. They presented about 30 of the top cited reasons for voting for Donald Trump, and they asked Donald Trump voters, why? Why did you choose Trump? Why not Kamala Harris? And looking at all voters, the top reason was inflation, followed by immigration, followed by cultural issues related to DEI and transgender issues. And among swing voters, it was the cultural issues that were the top reason. And so essentially, it looks like between these three reasons, we have sort of inflation as an economic reason and two cultural related issues. Academic research tends to suggest that it's not the economic indicators actually that are tightly correlated with support for authoritarian populists. It's actually these sort of more cultural features. And I think there's reasons for sort of discounting the inflation explanation in the United States as well. First of all, it's the second time that Trump has won, and inflation wasn't really a factor the first time. Second, Donald Trump's policies were almost certainly causally responsible for the inflation. Third, the Biden administration had brought inflation down about 6% leading up to the election, from 9% to a reasonable 3%. It's not Argentina over there. And finally, the fact that academic research seems to suggest that cultural issues are better predictors of support for authoritarian populists. And that might be good news for liberalism, right? So what is liberalism if not an ability to deal with cultural differences, to sort of find a way to cooperate, to tolerate, to strike a compromise with people who have different worldviews, who have different values, who want to live according to one set of norms that might differ from our favorite norms. And so how have liberals and in the liberal political culture managed to deal with this? Have we managed to accommodate this sort of diversity? I think at least in the United States, the answer is definitely no. Liberalism has not exactly come to the rescue in the context of the United States, at least not in the liberal political culture. We've seen the rise of various attempts by liberals to achieve a kind of consensus on values that often looks like moral browbeating or imposition. Diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives, and I'm not going to criticize DEI. I think that DEI is a reasonable interpretation of several values that are true values. Instead, I want to emphasize that what DEI is doing is offering a very specific interpretation of values. So for diversity, for example, which can be understood in various ways, it emphasizes diversity along racial, gender, and sexual orientation lines. Equity, it's a specific interpretation of equality, is looking at equality of outcomes between groups as picked out by the first concept, diversity. And inclusion refers to a kind of experience or feeling of inclusion, especially for individuals who are part of marginalized groups as identified in the diversity category. Again, I'm not trying to criticize these interpretations or say that they're not real values. I'm merely trying to point out this is a very specific interpretation. And it does differ from the mainstream interpretation. If you ask most people, what dimensions of diversity do you feel are most important? Many people would say intellectual diversity or maybe socioeconomic status. If you ask them, how should we interpret equality? They would probably say equal treatment of individuals rather than equal outcomes for groups, which sometimes necessitates unequal treatment of individuals. And despite being a kind of idiosyncratic or unique interpretation of these values, one that is reasonable, but is certainly not the uniquely reasonable interpretation, DEI has become a prerequisite for working at universities, sometimes for working in government agencies until recently, and even in certain corporations, it's a prerequisite. So it's sort of come to be a requirement to engage in many parts of social and economic life in the United States. The picture is from the infamous Masterpiece Cake Shop versus Colorado case, in which a gay couple wanted to buy a wedding cake from Masterpiece Cake Shop, and the religious owner said that he would not provide such a cake. They sued the owner and won the case, and the owner was ordered by the state of Colorado to either cease selling wedding cakes or to sell wedding cakes to any gay couple that asks for them. This was in 2012. Gay marriage was not yet even legal in Colorado. And then finally, this pie chart is sort of a survey that is undertaken each year by FIRE, which is the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression. where they rank the sort of robustness of protections of speech at our universities. And they find that a very small minority, 12.3% in this year, actually provide robust protections for freedom of expression. So in these institutions that are supposed to be fora for critical discussion and debate, students and faculty often feel that they can't express their viewpoints. And typically it is the conservative or religious faculty and students that feel that they cannot express their viewpoints. So in all of these cases, what we're seeing is that liberals are using social pressure, institutional pressure, sometimes even legal pressure, to try to achieve conformity with what they view as the correct values or the correct idea of justice. And I don't think the situation is terribly different in Europe. So this is a photo of a Finnish politician. She's very conservative and religious, and noticed that her Lutheran church was sponsoring Helsinki Pride Festival. So she posted a Bible verse which says, homosexual acts are shameful, which is in Romans 1:24 through 1:27, and said, should the church really be sponsoring these activities that aren't endorsed by the Bible? So sort of a translation, if you're curious about exactly what she posted, in case you don't read Finnish. As a result of this tweet, she spent about 5 years in court cases where she was deemed to have engaged in incitement. She eventually won. This was in 2019 when it started. She won the case and was acquitted, but just last week I read in The Economist that they're considering reopening the case, allowing the prosecutor to have another go at her for posting this Bible verse. It's written in the Bible. It's something that a lot of people believe, unfortunately, in my opinion, but it is out there and people do think this way. Finally, this is sort of a general trend of not protecting freedom of expression on the continent and in the UK. This article in The Economist last week pointed out that apparently in the UK, according to this article, there are 1,000 arrests every month for offensive things that are posted on social media and even in private messages like WhatsApp or emails. So I think what we're seeing in all these cases is that liberal political culture has not, so to speak, extended the olive branch. It has not sought to achieve a compromise between clashing cultures or to accommodate diversity of values on these fronts. Instead, it's sought to achieve a kind of conformity in behavior and in speech that conforms to the values that liberals uphold. And so I think it's safe to say that liberals today, on both sides of the Atlantic, are indulging in a kind of fantasy, sometimes even the imposition of consensus. They want to believe that everyone accepts their particular values and even more so their interpretation of those values. And also a presumption of finality. And what I mean by finality is sort of the idea that we've got the right answer, that the search process is over. And because the search process is over, we no longer need to engage in critical debate and discussion. In fact, critical debate and discussion might even pose a threat insofar as they convince other people that our answer isn't the correct answer. And I want to call the kind of liberalism that exhibits these two properties ambitious liberalism. It's ambitious in the sense that it seeks to achieve consensus on justice or impose it. And it's ambitious in the sense that it seeks final answers. It wants to answer questions about values once and for all. And so that's so much for introductory chit chat. What I want to do in this talk with the remainder of our time is identify the political theory that I think corresponds to ambitious liberalism. I want to demonstrate why this is a flawed and unhelpful political theory. And I want to try to present an alternative, one that better copes with deep diversity and sort of the challenges we're seeing from especially right-wing authoritarian populism. And so what I'm assuming in the background of this talk is that there is some connection between political culture and political theory. That's not totally uncontroversial. Now, I'm not claiming that it's a super strong connection. I'm not assuming that, one view might be, well, thought leaders, politicians, they go through universities, they absorb theories, and then they espouse those theories in public, and that influences the political culture or determines it. I have in mind something even weaker than that, something like political theory develops a set of resources or tools that can be drawn upon by politicians, thought leaders, or even people just engaging in public discourse. And as long as you accept that idea, which I don't think is terribly controversial, then you can be on board for the rest of the talk. And if you do accept that there's a connection between political theory and the political culture, then what we need to be asking ourselves is sort of where is the current state of political theory today? So who's the dominant political theorist? And what sorts of tools are our thought leaders and us as we engage in political discussion, what are we able to draw upon from political theory? Well, about 50 years ago, I think Nozick wrote a sentence that is more true today than it was when he wrote it. Robert Nozick, political philosopher at Harvard, wrote this: political philosophers now must either work within Rawls's theory or explain why not. He's referring to John Rawls, the great political theorist, who published his sort of magnum opus in 1971, A Theory of Justice. So this quote was 3 years after that was published. Since that time, it's only come to dominate political philosophy more. And in my experience in political philosophy, I think it is safe to say that philosophers tend to either work within Rawls's paradigm or explain why we shouldn't. And this talk is certainly a version of the latter. I'm going to try to explain why we should not work within that framework. And I think that what's interesting about the fact that Rawls is the dominant political theorist today is that he sort of, the theory that he lays out, I think amplifies, or certainly reflects, these two key features of ambitious liberalism that I pointed out: consensus and finality. And this is clearest in sort of one of the key constructs in his political theory. It's less appreciated than other constructs, but I think it's just as important as anything else in his political theory. And this is the idea of the well-ordered society. So for Rawls, when you're thinking about justice, what you want to do is kind of envision that conception of justice fully implemented in your society and appraise how that society would look if everybody's complying with it. It's a kind of, for him, what he calls a realistic utopia. This is sort of like the ideal state. Once you find the correct conception of justice, what you want is for people to accept that conception and to follow it. And so when they do so, you have what's called a well-ordered society. And in particular, it exhibits these two conditions. First, everyone accepts and knows that the others accept the same principles of justice. And two, the basic social institutions generally satisfy and are generally known to satisfy these principles. So you have a kind of widespread acceptance and endorsement of the principles of justice, and people follow them. And there's common knowledge that other people also accept them and that they're reflected in your basic social institutions. Crucially for Rawls, the well-ordered society must be stable. He says that stability is a desirable feature of moral conceptions. In fact, however attractive a conception of justice might be on other grounds, it is seriously defective if it is unstable. So we can sort of see that there's these two features of Rawls's well-ordered society and political theory that sort of come out here. The well-ordered society assumes a kind of homogeneity and a kind of stasis. It's homogeneous because people have to accept the same conception of justice. They're accepting exactly the same principles. There's widespread agreement about that. And it's static in the sense that it's stable. They sort of endorse the same principles of justice over time. In fact, he thinks they're stabilized by certain psychological dispositions. He refers to the sense of justice as that disposition. And notice that this immediately raises two threats for the good society or the well-ordered society. First, diversity becomes a threat. Why? Because people have to agree on the same conception of justice. As soon as you start getting disagreement on justice, the well-orderedness of your society begins to dissipate. And second, dynamism becomes a threat because people need to agree on this conception of justice across time. So in this sort of ideal society of justice, we're trying to avoid a certain dimension of diversity, and we're trying to avoid dynamism. We don't want change in the moral beliefs, at least the beliefs pertaining to justice of that society. And so you can see how this is reflected, or reflects, I suppose, the two features of ambitious liberalism. So if we think that consensus is very important, then diversity becomes a threat. And if we think that we've achieved finality, or we desire to achieve finality, then we're not striving for a a society that exhibits dynamism. And so I guess I wanted to sort of draw a line right here. That's the descriptive portion of the talk. Maybe my attitudes came through, but I was trying to be very impartial and purely descriptive there. And I want to sort of shift modes here to a more critical mode. So maybe the gloves can come off a little bit. First, I want to focus on diversity. So I'm going to say less about diversity than dynamism. I as exhibited by the title of the talk, but also because a lot of people have written about diversity. There's a whole sort of cottage industry called New Diversity Theory. If you're curious to read more about Rawls and diversity, you can read Gerald Gauss's work. I just want to point out how strange it is that we have a liberal theorist, in fact, the preeminent liberal theorist, who's depicting a kind of ideal society in which diversity of thought poses a threat to that society. That's very strange. That seems contradictory to the spirit of liberalism and also to the origins of liberalism. You know, as Rawls himself points out, liberalism emerged from about 150 years of almost continuous conflict and violence in the religious wars, characterized by deep disagreement about values, about religion and metaphysical beliefs that people held so strongly they were willing to kill for them. Liberalism emerges from this as a theory that seeks to justify and even inspire tolerance and cooperation amongst people who have deeply diverse views about the nature of the good society. This is what Locke's A Letter Concerning Toleration is about. This is what Pierre Bayle is getting at in his Commentaire philosophique. And so I find it just a bit ironic that we now have this great liberal theorist that sees diversity as something that needs to be mitigated or minimized in the ideal society. That's all I will say about diversity. The rest of the talk I'm going to be focusing on dynamism. So one thing to appreciate about dynamism is sort of the inspiration Rawls took from social science. He thought of analyzing a conception of justice almost as a kind of equilibrium analysis. And he was deeply inspired by social science that was very cutting edge in the 50s and 60s. Rawls was actually really ahead of the curve on this. It's very impressive for a philosopher to have been as well versed as he was, and he was in dialogue with a lot of these people as well. So for example, Kenneth Arrow, who won the Nobel Prize in Economics for proving with Gerard de Brue the existence of general equilibrium in suitably modeled economies, sort of inspires Rawls so much so that Rawls adopts the very term general equilibrium. He calls it general reflective equilibrium instead of a general market equilibrium. But Kenneth Arrow's sort of proof shows that if you model the utility functions, the production functions correctly, you can show that there exists a price list such that every single market will simultaneously clear. Supply will equal demand in all markets for all goods and services simultaneously for any number of goods. And so Rawls is thinking not about a market system, but actually about a kind of social moral system in which what we're trying to balance are not the various demand and production behaviors of consumers and producers, but instead the various considered moral judgments of individuals within the moral system. And instead of a price list creating that balance, what we get are a set of principles that generate that sort of balance, that equilibrium. So in his sort of description of general reflective equilibrium, he says, since citizens recognize that they affirm the same public conception of political justice, reflective equilibrium is also general. The same conception of justice is affirmed in everyone's considered judgments. So as you can see here, he thinks of the well-ordered society as exhibiting this kind of equilibrium. It's in a general reflective equilibrium in the sense that all citizens are endorsing the same conception of justice that's allowing them to balance their various considered moral judgments with one another's. Similarly, you have a lot of influence from game theory. Rawls uses game theory throughout a theory of justice. He talks about best reply functions. He talks about Nash equilibria. And he uses simple games like the prisoner's dilemma to illustrate his point. He says here, justice as fairness appears to be a sufficiently stable conception because the hazards of the generalized prisoner's dilemma are removed by the match between the right and the good. And John Nash, in the same period, proved the existence of equilibria for all finite games. Interestingly, John Nash and Arrow both relied upon something called Kakutani's fixed point theorem to make their proofs. I've argued elsewhere that you can't do that for social moral systems because social moral systems don't satisfy any of the conditions that allow you to deduce the existence of equilibria in Kakutani's theorem. But in this talk, I don't want to focus on the existence of equilibria. I want to focus on their stability. So even if you have an equilibrium, it's quite possible that a small perturbation will lead you careening on a new trajectory away from that equilibrium, and that you won't return to it. Or if you don't start in that equilibrium, there's no force that will attract you to it. And if the well-ordered society, even if it is an equilibrium, if the equilibrium is unstable, you're unlikely to remain there for very long. And this, I think, leads to what I call the problem of liberal stability. In general, liberal systems are not equilibrating systems. They're not the kind of system where once you've gotten to an equilibrium, assuming there even is an equilibrium, that you're likely to stay there. And they're not the kind of system such that if you're out of equilibrium, you will be sort of sucked into or drawn to, as if by a magnetic force, to the equilibrium. They're not that kind of system. And I think there's sort of two broad classes of reasons that make me think this. The first one's empirical, and I think these are sort of the more obvious reasons. If you look at a liberal society, they're constantly undergoing moral change. People are revising their moral beliefs, people are changing their values, they're engaging in debate and discussion, and all of these things are in flux over time. Take the United States, for example. It's not a very old country. In a short period of time, we've seen the prohibition of slavery, we've seen the achievement of women's suffrage, we've seen the civil rights movement, we've seen the gay rights movement, we've seen trans rights. This is a constant, dynamic change in the value system. People's values are not sort of given data that you then can deduce an equilibrium from. And if you were moving towards some sort of equilibrium, given a set of values, by the time you got there, the values will have changed and the equilibrium will be in a new spot, which is tantamount to saying there is no equilibrium. Now, it seems like what's driving this kind of dynamism that we observe in these examples, these sorts of social movements, are two things that are interestingly core to liberal political systems. The first is freedom of expression. The right to go out there and express a viewpoint is part of what drives this process, right? If everybody had to be quiet about what they really believed, you wouldn't have had any of these movements. Second, the right of a freedom of association. The ability to get together with other people who have a similar agenda and pursue a political or social goal is part of what enables this, perhaps facilitates this or encourages this kind of dynamism to occur. And so what I think that means is that basic features of a liberal society are the sort of thing that guarantee that you get moral dynamism. It's not like liberalism and dynamism really come apart. It's that the sort of quintessential liberal rights are the very thing that enables dynamism. So in addition to these sorts of empirical examples, I think there's deep theoretical reasons for thinking that any equilibrium in a liberal society will be unstable. And to develop that argument, I'm going to run through a model. I develop it more carefully in the paper this talk is based on. But it helps to look at the model to sort of appreciate the main mechanisms that are driving the instability in the system, and also to see how general the result is. So in this system, what I'm essentially doing, the basic idea is to look at a social morality as an interconnected web of values. They're interdependent in the sense that as you change one value, you change other values, or you affect their rate of change. And that over time, this system of values, being interdependent, sort of moves through the value space to some extent. And that at any given time, if you look at any value, its direction and rate of change is going to be determined by the current system state, namely the degree of prominence of all the other values in the system. So V1 through Vn, each in this system of equations, represent different values. And how large or small that magnitude is can represent the prominence of the value in the system at time t. So V1 of t is how prominent, how many people accept value 1 at time t, how strongly do they hold it. Whereas if it's very small, it would mean that very few people accept it, or they hold it very weakly. If it's very large, it means lots of people hold it, and they hold it strongly. V dot is the rate of change of the value. So on the left-hand side of the equations, what we're doing is we're tracking the changes at time t of the value system, of each value, right? And taken as a whole, that's the trajectory of the total system through time. And the small a's represent the degree of connection, the sort of type of relationship that that value has to other values. So values can be competitive or they can be complementary. Some values reinforce each other, some values compete with one another. For example, if V1 is equity as understood in DEI, V2 might be the classical liberal notion of equality as careers open to talents. Those are going to be sort of competing values because when you have more of one, you tend to have less of the other. And so that means that the coefficient A21, for example, A sub 21, that's going to be a negative value because as V1 increases, it's going to drive V2 down. That's sort of the mechanism of how these systems of equations are working here. And so the main takeaway, the whole idea of this model is just to think of values as interdependent, as an interdependent web. and to notice that if we think of them that way, we can track the trajectory of the value system through time as a response to the states of the other values in the system. That's 90% of all I want this model to communicate. The last 10% is actually the payoff, which is that once you do this, you can apply matrix stability theory to ask whether or not an equilibrium in this system is likely to be stable or unstable. Now, I don't know if anybody who has modeled a social morality as a system of differential equations, but people have looked at this type of system. This is a very common type of system of equations. In fact, as far back as 1970, we had Martin Gardner and W. Ross Ashby, one of the founders of cybernetics, who took a look at this type of system and asked precisely the question that I'm curious about here, which is how likely is it that such a system will be stable? What they looked at were two things. They said, what if we increase the number of equations? For us, that would mean increasing the number of values in the system, which is a proxy for diversity, actually. So what if we increase the diversity of values in our moral system? And second, what if we increase the connectedness of those values? And connectedness just means that the coefficients, the little a's, are non-zero. Because if they're zero, it means there's no relationship between the values. If they're non-zero, it means they affect one another. So as we increase the connectance, as we increase the number of non-zero coefficients, and as we increase the number of values in the system, what happens? Well, they map out their results here. So on the x-axis, you have connectance, which is, again, the number of non-zero coefficients. On the y-axis, you have the probability of stability. And these three lines correspond to different numbers of equations. So for us, different numbers of values in the system. The sort of flatter one is if there's 4 values in the system. The middle one that's slightly steeper, it's labeled with a 7. That's if there's 7 values. And the far left one is for 10 values. Now, if you notice, by the time your system gets to 10 values, you don't need very much connectance at all to be virtually assured that your equilibrium will be unstable. And in our society, there are thousands, maybe millions, depending on how you count them, of interrelated values. The likelihood that our system, that our social moral system, will be a stable equilibrium, supposing it has an equilibrium, is effectively 0, given this analysis. And so the takeaway here is that as you increase diversity and as you increase connectedness, both of which are features of complexity, the likelihood of stability becomes vanishingly small. The upshot is that complexity undermines stability. Okay, so we can return to the problem of liberal stability now and lay it out as a kind of syllogism. I'm trained as a philosopher, so it's mandatory that I have a syllogism. This is the only one. First, complex systems are not equilibrating systems. That, I think, is supported by the model, also seems to be supported by empirical examples. Liberal systems, such as liberal social morality, are complex systems. I think this follows from reflecting on the amount of diversity within these systems and the amount of connection you get between people and between values through rights such as freedom of expression and freedom of association. Finally, you conclude from these two premises that liberal systems are not equilibrating systems. So the sort of surprising upshot of this is that the well-ordered society can't be both stable and liberal. You have to pick one. And in fact, this sort of longing for stability or assumption of stability might be why I think this theory and the sort of public political culture it reflects has done such a bad job of dealing with diversity. And that's because in some sense, it isn't actually liberal. Liberalism is good at dealing with diversity almost by definition. So this is sort of an explanation in some sense, this longing for finality and for a lack of change and for the conditions that would allow such a society to be stable rules out the conditions in which you really have a liberal society. And so where does this leave us? Well, first, the liberal political culture, I believe, is failing to cope with diversity and dynamism. It's not doing well with challenges from the populist right. The leading liberal theory casts diversity and dynamism, which I think are inevitable features of a liberal society, as menacing threats to the well-ordered society. And this is very reminiscent. When I was writing this slide out, it reminded me of a quote from John Dewey, where he's criticizing an earlier group of liberals. He says, the tragedy, and I think it applies just as much to the Rawlsian liberals that I'm critiquing, he says the tragedy is that although these liberals were sworn foes of political absolutism, they were themselves absolutists in the social creed they formulated. In some sense, there's something illiberal about this approach, premised upon homogeneity and stability. So where can liberal theory go from here? I think what we need is a more liberal liberalism. I think instead of this fantasy of consensus, we should embrace diversity. We need a theory that does this. Instead of finality, we need a theory that leaves room for an open-ended process of cultural dynamism. And if we're going to call the first one ambitious liberalism, maybe we can call the second one modest liberalism. It's modest in at least a couple ways. It doesn't assume that we can achieve consensus on justice. And it doesn't think that we're ever at the end point of inquiry, that we've sort of solved all the moral problems and found the right values and answers. And so if we're trying to develop this new kind of liberalism, this more liberal liberalism, do we have to start from scratch? I think, thankfully, the answer is no. I think that there is actually a long tradition in 20th century liberal thought. In fact, it might be the main strand within liberal thought of the 20th century prior to Rawls, of a highly sort of diversity embracing, highly dynamism embracing liberalism. And it traces its roots back to the 19th century in the work of John Stuart Mill. Now, Mill is perhaps most famous for his defense of freedom of speech. And sort of the core idea there is that we can be wrong about our beliefs, both moral, scientific, political beliefs. And what we need to sort of address that kind of an issue is diverse viewpoints, launching a series of critiques against us and our viewpoints so that we can learn to correct those errors. In fact, even if we have the right answer, this is highly beneficial because without this kind of diversity sort of confronting our viewpoints, we'll hold them merely as what he calls dead dogmas rather than living truths. And he sort of acknowledges this process through his idea of experiments in living, where he thinks people should be free to go out, try out different values, try out different ways of living, and see how they work. And he sort of nods to this idea of moral progress, even in his work on political economy. He tells us, so wonderful are the changes, both moral and economical, taking place in our age, that without perpetually rewriting a work like the present, it is impossible to keep up with them. John Dewey, I think, is another very powerful advocate of dynamic liberalism. Dewey thought that democracy should be prior to philosophy, that practice should be prior to theory, that what you do is you go out, you choose things democratically, you see how they play out, and then you reflexively adjust your assumptions and values based on the outcomes. There's a kind of experiential learning about how values and morality interact with the world. There's a lot of quotes I could have chosen for John Dewey, but I couldn't resist the temptation to pick this one because of what he says about protective fantasies in the last part. He says, the fact of change has been so continual and so intense that it overwhelms our minds. It is not surprising that men have protected themselves from the impact of such fast change by resorting to what psychoanalysis has taught us to call rationalizations, in other words, protective fantasies. I'm thinking of consensus and stasis as a kind of protective fantasy. It's nice to think that everybody agrees with us and that we found the final answers once and for all. Diametrically opposed to John Dewey's political beliefs are F.A. Hayek's, but Hayek agrees with Dewey on this sort of meta point about dynamic learning, about sort of dynamic process through which we improve morality. In fact, he has a very evolutionary account of how morals emerge. And he says that if we are to advance, we have to leave room for continuous revision of our present conceptions and ideals, which will be necessitated by further experience. We're not just improving our empirical knowledge, we're also improving our ideals through experience. And his sort of epistemic humility comes out in the second part of the quote. He says, we are as little able to conceive what civilization will be or can be 500 or even 50 years hence as our medieval forefathers or even our grandparents were able to foresee our manner of life today. And so this is just a very strong repudiation of this idea of finality. The idea of experiential learning about morality is seconded by Hayek's contemporary, Walter Lippmann, who says all the fixity of eternal principles comes crashing about your head if you derive them simply from human experience. And William James might be sort of the most radical advocate of experiential learning for moral improvement. He thinks that not only is ethics just a continual project of improvement and a continual search process, but that in fact, a priori morality doesn't even make sense to try to do morality before you've experienced the world and tried things out. He says there is no such thing possible as an ethical philosophy dogmatically made up in advance. In other words, there can be no final truth in ethics any more than in physics until the last man has had his experience and his say. And finally, Karl Popper, who really thought about taking this vision and putting it into an institutional or social context. He has this idea of the open society, which supports various interpretations. To me, it means that everything is open to examination and criticism, that ideas are constantly to be challenged, and that by doing so, we generate a process, a highly beneficial process. He tells us that if we wish to remain human, then there is only one way, the way into the open society. We must go into the unknown, the uncertain, and the insecure. Dynamism, because it's facilitated by human agency and freedom, produces results that cannot be predicted. To embrace liberalism, you have to embrace the emergence of unpredictable states. And so we have this incredibly rich tradition throughout the 20th century. These are, really heavy-hitting thinkers, all supporting this view that's extremely friendly to ideological and intellectual diversity, and that thinks that, in fact, that diversity drives a beneficial process of dynamic learning. And yet, they gave way and were eclipsed by Rawlsian political theory for some reason. It's as if liberal political theory came to a fork in the road and just took the wrong turn. And I think it's worth backtracking and seeing what happens if we take the other turn. And even though I call it modest liberalism, I think that if we take the other turn, there are a series of ambitions that we can have. First of all, I think that a very important sort of fundamental ambition of modest liberalism is convergence on acceptable rules. And I mean this, this is worded very carefully. So convergence is to be contrasted to consensus. The idea of consensus, at least in Rawlsian theory, is that you have this kind of justificatory framework and you accept how certain fundamental reasons ultimately support your consensus on a conception of justice. Here, convergence is meant to mean you might not agree at all on the reasons for agreeing to these rules. You might have entirely opposed, contradictory worldviews, in fact, but you all can find some reason within your own worldview for accepting the set of rules that we are to converge on. I chose the word acceptable to be contrasted with ideal or correct or even true. They're acceptable in the sense that you can live with them. These various groups are trying to live under a shared set of rules, finds that the set of rules doesn't contradict their deep moral foundations, might even be supported by them, but no one thinks, or maybe hardly anyone thinks, these are the best rules they could possibly conceive of. This is not their ideal society. This is a society that gives them rules that allow them to interact, cooperate with one another. And finally, rules, not justice, not morality. A set of basic institutions that enable coordination and cooperation. That's really the ambition of modest liberalism. To think that we can achieve consensus and even convergence on a full conception of justice, I think, is utopian in a negative sense. And Chandran Kukathas is the liberal theorist living today, I think, who most appreciates this idea of liberalism, this focus on institutions. He says it would be a profound mistake to think that the primary question political philosophy ought to pursue in addressing the problem of group conflict is the question of justice. And so the point here is that liberal institutions are in some sense more important than liberal justice, especially when you're confronting deep pluralism and deep diversity. The second ambition directly follows, or I should say, by the way, this is basically David Hume's view. He calls it justice, but that's an anachronism. For David Hume, justice refers to the most minimal set of social norms possible that makes social living sort of something that we can endure under the circumstances of justice. It's nothing more than that. And that sort of, I think, is the right idea. So another source of inspiration for focusing on institutions rather than what we would today call the conception of justice, I think can be found in David Hume. Second, and this directly follows from the first ambition, the maximal inclusion of perspectives. If you're trying to get people to agree to a set of minimal rules, those minimal rules need to make it possible for them to live the sort of life they want in the sort of community that they want. That's essentially the problem of how do we take these apparently competing, apparently contradictory ideals and worldviews and put them into a system where they can coexist. William James saw this more clearly than anybody. He has very interesting things to say about this. He says we must always opt for the richer universe, for the good which seems most organizable, most fit to enter into complex combinations, most apt to be a member of a more inclusive whole. The idea is to combine these conflicting views at our intention, to find institutional arrangements that make them, so to speak, compossible. We're looking for the largest possible set that makes all of these perspectives possible at the same time. And he views this as essentially the role of the politician or the statesman. This echoes in a very interesting way, or I guess precedes, what Hannah Arendt says about the statesman. And I don't know that these two were in dialogue at all, but I find this similarity really striking. She tells us in her essay on Socratic politics that if we want to define traditionally the one outstanding virtue of the statesman, we could say that it consists in understanding the greatest possible number and variety of realities, as those realities open themselves up to the various opinions of citizens. So the statesman is supposed to be finding ways to combine a very diverse array of opinions and perspectives into a ideally harmonious whole, but at least a whole that's functional. And finally, and I think this follows from the first two, we want to facilitate self-organization. One of the ways in which you allow for compossibility between various competing ideals and worldviews is you allow individuals to coalesce into communities where they can live according to the sorts of rules and according to the sorts of social moralities that make sense to them, that they view as sort of supportive of the good life. And I have sort of two theoretical pillars for this view. One is moral or philosophical, and the other is institutional. So the sort of moral view is inspired by Michael Muller's multi-level social contract theory. So his view is that the kind of morality you can engage in with other people is entirely based on the degree that you have shared values with them. Some of us have almost no shared values in common. If that's the situation, the rules you can agree on are very minimal, very thin set. But as you work down from that super high abstract level and you get to more communities or neighborhoods or even families, the set of moral rules, the sort of kind of moral terms of engagement you can construct with them become more nuanced. They become richer in some sense because you have so many shared background value assumptions. And so what you want in a really sort of, I think, a healthy pluralistic society is room for people to form these kind of richer communities bound together by comprehensive moral systems sort of at the local level. But as you move up the tier and you're trying to get more and more diverse people to be able to coexist, the morality can't be so rich, it can't be so nuanced. And the kind of institutional structure that supports that, I think, is one that's polycentric. Polycentric structures have multiple centers, as the name suggests, and this allows for self-organization into communities where you share a lot of values, and you can then construct those richer moralities that have more of a shared basis. So the conclusions here, just to sort of gloss over what I've covered in this talk, I think that to aid liberal politics, we need a liberal theory that accepts dynamism and diversity. This hasn't been the case. Our dominant liberal theorists since Rawls, have largely focused on determining the nature of true justice and imagining homogeneous and static utopias founded upon it. But 20th century dynamic liberals, what I've called modest liberals, I think saw these challenges more clearly and sort of have a better approach to addressing them. And that's to focus on the institutional framework, specifically one that harnesses diversity to drive a beneficial process of experimentation and revision. And so to conclude, I think it's worth sort of considering this idea that I laid out in the second bullet point about Rawlsian utopia. Rawls tells us that one of the tasks of political philosophy is that it should be realistically utopian. That is, it should probe the limits of practical political possibility. I completely agree with this. I think political philosophy is, in some sense, an imaginative discipline. We shouldn't content ourselves with the way we find things right now. But I think we need to revisit the idea of utopia as Rawls views it, because what we want is not an authoritarian or absolutist utopia. We want a liberal utopia. And so it's not a kind of engineering project where we can lay down the principles in advance, knowing how people are going to want to live 100 or 1,000 years from now. We haven't achieved the end of the search process. Liberal utopia isn't an engineering project in that sense. And that's because liberal utopia is a society in flux. Instead of thinking of liberal utopia as a kind of engineering project and liberal theorists as engineers of a certain type, we need to think about liberal utopia as a sort of ecosystem that seeks to combine the maximum diversity of different perspectives and allow them to coexist side by side. And in that sense, liberal theorists aren't engineers, but ecologists. Because in short, liberal utopia is diverse and adaptive. And I think this is kind of the essence of the liberal vision that we must revive. Thank you. Oh, I touched on a bunch of ideas that are in papers. If you're curious about reading more into what I talked about today, a lot of it was really fast and kind of a quick gloss, but.
All right, thank you very much for that absolutely fascinating and stimulating talk, Alexander. So let's open it up for questions now. And since I'm sure that there are many people who want to ask things, if I could just ask you to just try to make sure that, to the extent possible, that your question is brief and stated as a question. So just in the order in which I saw people, individual right in front of me.
Yeah, hi, Alex. So my question is about the framing of the talk. So the way you spoke at the beginning about Donald Trump, and I'm thinking in the UK context, equivalents might be Nigel Farage or the populist Reform Party. It's interesting to think, given your presentation, who are today's Rawlsians? So I think you'd make a strong case for saying that the Rawlsians today are the Nigel Farages and the Donald Trumps. And the reason that I say that is the following. Rawls wants a stable, well-ordered society, a homogeneous society. Many of the people in those groups are campaigning for homogeneity. He models the choice of justice-satisfying institutions as being you're choosing rules for a closed society. That's, if you like, keeping the immigrants out, which is exactly what the Faragists and the various populists want. So isn't there a case to be made for saying that today's Rawlsians, you see this in Scandinavia, where the welfare state is being defended on a kind of anti-immigration platform, that today's Rawlsians are the populists. And actually what the populists are pushing back against is the notion of a dynamic society, where there's flux, where there's pluralism, these sorts of things. So that's really my question. Sorry, it's kind of really about the framing of this, of where's the Rawlsian fit into this?
Thanks, yeah. I think it is striking that in A Theory of Justice, Rawls says that it's a theory for a closed society, that you enter by birth and leave by death. That's a really striking assumption to make in a liberal theory, certainly when you couldn't make an open society-based kind of theory. I think that when I talk to people that are right of center, they see themselves as fighting fire with fire. So it's kind of like Nixon said, we're all Keynesians now, maybe we're all Rawlsians now, and that's part of the problem is that they say, well, if they're going to force their vision of morality on us, we're going to force it on them. And so I think there needs to be, and again, I'm not a policy person, but ideally what I'd like to see is a de-escalation. I think the stakes of losing right now have become so high because of the amount of power and the amount of sort of mandate that winners of political contests think they have. And so if you see yourself as fighting fire with fire, it's really important that you don't lose a political election, because then everything, I mean, we've seen the first 100 days of Donald Trump have been insane. So yeah, I think that's a correct observation in some sense. Many of the features that I've criticized liberals for are exactly the features exhibited by right-wing politicians and authoritarian populists. I guess I think that it's not hypocritical as much for them to exhibit them. Whereas with liberals, we can do better, I think.
All right, thank you.
Yeah, just my question, I mean, how would you rank, well, first, just a point, I feel he's not doing fully justice to Rawls. He's obviously accepting a lot of diversity of religious beliefs, of ethical forms of life, and there's already a relatively minimal sense of justice, distributive justice. So I would say, I still think it's too much. I agree with you. I'm very much, you have sensibility with where you're going and the reference you name. And now I want to ask you if you again have, let's say, on the one other hand, you expect to have Michael Rawls's thick and thin morality. Where would you put Habermas, who's also trying to be very open, also into religious communities, and there's this kind of minimal transcendental discourse ethics sets of principles one would have to subscribe to, and that should have a degree of stability. I mean, I'm tending towards this but with more libertarian politics attached to this, where these different groups, I think, can exist but should never be subsidized, and that ultimately non-economically viable form of existence would self-evolve away from let's say dysfunctional ideologies. So I trust an evolutionary process. But anyway, that's the question. Where would you look at, let's say, Habermas, and aren't you, there's this kind of contest of ever more minimalism. Where would you place Habermas on that?
Thank you so much. I first want to address the not being fair to Rawls.
Yeah.
In some sense, that's completely correct because I really focused on 1971 Rawls, right? And what you see in political liberalism is that Rawls starts to realize that the 1971 project is unraveling. A lot of the criticisms I made, I think are things that started to dawn on Rawls in sort of his later days. And so if we want to pick up where Rawls left off, I think dynamic liberalism is the approach. And you see this in 1993, he publishes Political Liberalism, right? And he says, well, the account in A Theory of Justice won't work because I assumed they all accepted the thin theory of the good. Turns out the thin theory of the good isn't that thin, right? It has a whole bunch of assumptions about what people value in life. They all want primary goods. There's this Aristotelian principle of business. And he says, so we have to assume that people have different notions of the good. Fast forward 3 years to 96, he gives us the second edition, the revised edition of Political Liberalism. He says, well, okay, shucks, I guess people not only disagree about the good, they're also going to disagree about justice. And so now we need to reconcile with the fact that there are non-liberals in our society, and that instead of dealing with one conception of justice, my favorite, justice as fairness, we also have to sort of deal with this family of conceptions of justice. And once you have a family of conceptions of justice, the well-ordered society doesn't even make sense, right? You have to basically abandon the key theoretical construct of the whole theory. And so the theory was in complete disarray by the end of Rawls's life. In fact, the unpublished third revision of Political Liberalism, what you see is Rawls in his dying days going through and actually eliminating reference to justice as fairness in the book, which was the whole point of A Theory of Justice in 1971, was to develop justice as fairness. So Rawls was seeing more and more clearly, I think, that you're not going to get this shared consensus on the conception of justice. Rawls was very smart and very intellectually honest. And so I think that it is a bit unfair to focus on 1971, but it makes for a better talk. And that I think that the proposal that I'm giving is very much in the late Rawlsian spirit. And sort of that's where you want to pick up if you want to sort of develop that way of thinking further, really taking diversity seriously. As for Habermas, I think Habermas's sort of value or appraisal of discourse ethics is too controversial to serve as like a kind of justification you could give to all of society for accepting your conclusions. But I think it's the sort of view that would let you get to the kind of shared rules that we want to structure a liberal society. So it's sort of one route to get there, but it's not, again, what we're looking for is convergence, not consensus. So you have to allow for rules that can be justified by a very large variety of different routes.
Right, fantastic. So thank you. If you could just keep your hands raised so I can see everyone. So can we have a question from the person over there, please? So yes, you.
My question is the two forms of liberalism that you define or described as ambitious liberalism and modest liberalism almost seems to me to be more like not liberalism and liberalism.
What was the first one?
The ambitious liberalism, that seems to me more like just not really liberalism.
No, yeah.
And the modest liberalism seems more like liberalism. And I know you sort of tackled that when you went through the 20th century, more like, I guess, classic liberalism thinkers. But could you maybe describe a bit or account for how the homogeneous and stable version of liberalism or ambitious liberalism is actually liberalism, as perhaps most people would understand it? And if I might sneak in a quick second question, do you think there's a limit to dynamism in a polity? Does there come a point where it becomes just too dynamic and you almost have to collapse into polycentricity, or you perhaps don't have a cohesive polity such as the nation state?
Thank you. Yeah, I have to write down, when there's multiple parts, I got to write it down. Or I'm gonna so you first asked how can ambitious liberalism be a kind of liberalism? It's not, in some sense, right? I think liberalism is a contested concept. You could say that ambitious liberalism is liberal in the sense that they endorse freedom and they endorse equality, fundamental liberal values. But I think it's more of liberalism as a moral doctrine rather than liberalism as the basis for an actual political system. I think the political system they're envisioning and its instantiation isn't a very liberal society. Chandra Kukathas has this really interesting thought experiment where he says, imagine two societies, one where there's only one community you can live in, but it's super liberal, there's lots of freedom, lots of equality. One where you can move wherever you want, there's freedom of movement entirely. But every society is very conservative, right? They don't really embrace individualism or freedom or equality very much. He says, which society is more liberal? And it's like, well, they're liberal in different ways, right? I think that ambitious liberalism really does care about equality and tries to protect a range of freedoms. So it's liberal in that sense. But as I said, I think that the well-ordered society can't be both stable and liberal. So in some sense, I think that ambitious liberalism really is missing a key ingredient of liberalism, the kind of things that will cause dynamism to occur. And then the second one about the limits of dynamism, yeah, too much dynamism can definitely be disorienting. I think that one thing I didn't really get into in this talk is when you're thinking about this sort of very thin set of rules that can be endorsed from a wide variety of perspectives, those I think will evolve on a slower time scale than the richer conception of justice that Rawls envisions. Why? Well, because they have so many different lines of support and they're so multi-purpose, they're sort of valuable under such a wide array of different conditions that they don't become outdated as quickly. Whereas richer conceptions of justice that touch on more parts of lives, of our lives and involve more parts, those are the kinds of things that change more rapidly. So do we need like a stable bedrock that never changes? I actually don't think so, but I do think it helps to have like certain things that evolve slower than others. Sort of what James Buchanan might call relatively absolute absolutes. Thanks.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you. So the person in the second row, please.
Yeah, thank you. So I want to ask you about sort of the conceptual schema of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And you talked a lot about diversity, and I think you covered it quite justifiably. And I think that inclusion is sort of this emotive concept that's sort of difficult to characterize philosophically because it deals more with the individual's psychology and how they feel about the social situation that they're in. But I think what I really want to press you on is the idea of equity, because you didn't really talk that much about inequity or inequality. And I think that inequity or inequality, I'll just use inequality from here on, really sort of underpins differences that characterize diversity. So like ideological diversity is essentially underpinned by people's socioeconomic status in some sense. So I wonder how you would incorporate fundamental inequality into this sort of dynamic liberalism where you have these different polycentric centers, but at the same time, these polycentric centers are fundamentally different from one another. And they're fundamentally characterized by divergences in both ideology and socioeconomic background. And how you incorporate a more general liberalism that allows for this type of inequality, but also tries to mitigate it through like traditional like social welfare and like just like including everyone in allowing everyone to have a piece of the economic pie. So like what does your version of liberalism say to someone who says look at all this inequality in society? Clearly liberalism doesn't serve everyone when ideally it should. And yeah, what would you say to someone who troubled you for that point?
Right, great, thank you. That's a very important question. First, I like the point that you make about socioeconomic factors affecting ideological factors. Part of the misleading assumption I make in my value system model is that it's closed, that values are affected by their values. But in fact, it's much more complex than that. Socioeconomic environmental factors are affecting our ideologies all the time. And so with respect to inequalities, how do we justify the system to people who think maybe there's too much inequality? Or the approach is to allow communities, this is the sort of self-organization point. Some communities are going to have less tolerance for inequality. So they should organize institutions in which you mitigate inequality more, right? The key idea here is just to have something in it for everybody, so everyone has a reason to sign on and accept these rules. And that doesn't mean that everybody's going to get everything on their wish list, but for the things that they can't get for that overarching set of rules, they might be able to formulate some sort of community that better reflects their values. So within a framework, you have to leave scope for people to do things like start worker-owned co-ops and that sort of thing. And when you have that ability or that capacity for self-organization, you can actually address a lot of these concerns by just saying, you're allowed to do that, right? You just can't make other people do it.
Okay, great, thank you. So, so individual, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 rows back. So in the black shirt, yes.
Relates this to then the kind of voting system and the way we do politics on a real level. Those, when we do elections here or over the pond, tends to lead to kind of finding the biggest differences between the choices we have. It sort of seems to split people as much as possible, because that's how you differentiate, how you kind of wedge those swing voters into your side and show them the other side's evil. It might be a bit of a chicken or egg situation, but what needs to change, or how can we change the voting systems to have a more kind of dynamic liberalism that brings people together and finds some level of relation between those groups, when instead what we seem to do now is have sort of a winner takes all, where it may be liberal on the grand scheme of things, but for an average person who is voting every 4 years, even your sort of dynamic model of liberalism, I don't know if those people feel actually that they were part of a system that they would see as liberal, even if the system from a bird's eye view might be liberal. So I'm wondering if there's that disconnect between when you said kind of, I can't remember, it was the Rawls bit, kind of feels and it appears to others to feel as if it is liberal. I don't know how that matches with a sort of actual system that we would, based on this lecture, call dynamic liberal.
Yeah, great, thank you. Some questions are hard to answer because I've thought so much about them that I have too many things to say. This is not one of those. I'm not someone who studies voting systems, and there's a very technical literature on the properties of different voting systems and how you organize your democratic elections. All I think I can say is something pretty basic, which is that democracy is also about coalition building. And one thing that I think I'm sort of suggesting should happen, think about this vision of the statesman given to us by William James or Hannah Arendt, is that there are people in this sort of non-liberal camp who are not necessarily at the core of it, right? They're not like Nazis. They're kind of on the periphery. They're on the margin. And we need to give them reasons to not vote for the authoritarian populist and instead to support the liberal candidate. And as we saw in the voting data about why Trump won, those reasons haven't been given to the extent that they could be. And so we should focus on that sort of consensus building aspect of it, rather than alienating people by sort of seeking to impose very substantive, comprehensive values on a society-wide scale. In terms of particular structure of the voting system, I'm the wrong person to ask, but thanks, that's a really important question.
Okay, great, thanks. If you could keep your hands up. So in the interest of diversity, let me get a question from this side of the room. So, so you please.
Yeah, I have a question that sort of is related to your second one, which I think digs into the liberalism side of dynamic liberalism. I think the shape of this is, if the adjective that you're using is dynamic, does the noun matter at all? So I think as we embrace dynamism more and more, we can talk about the pace of change, but what are the values there? I guess, can we add some philosophical rigor to what makes liberalism important in this verse?
Great, thank you. Yeah, I love that question. So I think there are actually, a set of things that I would call general desiderata, general because they're not particular to a particular perspective or comprehensive doctrine, and desiderata because we want them. Arguably about 5 of the 10 commandments are actually things that any society would probably want at any time. In fact, there's probably certain features of societies without which societies can't even exist. So you can kind of make a transcendental kind of argument here that like there are just like values that are presuppositions of the existence of your society as being a society in some sense. And those are the sorts of things that are going to evolve on an incredibly slow timescale. And I think that actually responsiveness to changing values and expectations is one of those general desiderata. And that kind of responsiveness is greatly facilitated. In fact, the design of liberal institutions is kind of how do we structure our system so that it does effectively respond to changing priorities and changing ideals and values and expectations. So that's sort of like maybe one of the pieces of liberalism that I think will continue to be desired for all time, is that responsiveness, so that there's a kind of effect on the system as a whole when people's values and expectations change. But I think the set of things that we can assume will remain constant, so the kind of liberalism we can advocate as sort of transcending any particular time, it's going to be very thin liberalism. It's going to be very minimal. So yeah, thank you.
So, okay. So if you have questions, can you just hold your hands up so I can get a sense for what the queue is in the room? So 1, 2, yes, very quick follow-up.
It sounds basically like using liberalism just as a means to the end of dynamism. Is that sort of a fair framing?
You know, I haven't thought about it that way, but it might be. I'll think about it more. Thanks for that. Thanks for pointing that out. Let me just say quickly, as Dewey pointed out, like how we even understand basic concepts like liberty or equality shifts over time. And so our understanding of liberalism as a philosophy containing certain values will certainly shift, not just as certain values become downplayed or become more emphasized, but as the meaning of those values themselves even changes. So I don't believe that we have this fixed doctrine of liberalism that we can advocate for all time. So I think the way you put it is not how I would put it right now, but I will think more about that because that was an interesting way of expressing it. Thank you.
All right, thanks. So a question from the far back, please.
I'm interested in like the talk from like a consent perspective, maybe like to political power. In the sense of like I feel like ambitious liberalism is described as in particular Rawls has the problem of like trying to establish a very strong hypothetical consent in political power. I would be interested in what do you think, like what is your argument play into that, and does it maybe like lead to like a more like less demanding hypothetical consent to political power, or alternatively to like more room for like I don't know, like voluntarist models on this?
Yeah, great, thank you. I mean, right, so the hypothetical consent approach that Rawls takes depends on a shared conception of the person, a shared conception of society, and a shared conception of practical reason, all of which we have to accept because apparently these are embedded in our political culture. And then from that, we have a shared argument from the original position that this is the correct conception of justice, right? I don't think that is at all a viable approach for achieving agreement or what I would call convergence on a liberal framework. In fact, I think that's highly alienating to people that don't think of the person or of society in that way. It excludes all kinds of reasonable perspectives, both liberal and non-liberal, from being able to endorse the conception of justice that Rawls proposes. So yeah, I'm wary of using hypothetical consent model at all. I think we shouldn't think about the theorist imposing a conception of justice on society, but as rules kind of emerging from interactions between people as they make choices and strike bargains. I'm partial to a more sort of bottom-up approach to shared rules. But yeah, thank you for that opportunity to criticize hypothetical consent theories.
All right, excellent. So question from that individual right there. Yes, yeah. Right.
I think, if I'm not mistaken, the offshoot of this is that we should be modest, but we can agree or should agree on moral values. I also think that many liberals, and probably also the liberals that you framed as ambitious liberals, already think that they are quite modest. So what if we take a value like, I don't know, protecting minorities, for example, because I think it plays a big role when it comes to this equity movement and diversity movement. It seems that the right has a core problem with accepting that value. And what can we do if it turns out that we can't even have agreement when it comes to these core
Great, thank you. Yeah, I think you search out the points where you do have agreement, you implement those, and then for the areas where differences are irreconcilable, you construct or self-organize into communities that uphold the values that you endorse. And so like with like the values in DEI, again, the point's not to criticize their interpretation or their values, it's the way that they try to go about implementing them on sort of a society-wide scale simultaneously, and try to get people who do not agree with these interpretations to behave and speak as if they do. We have to just sort of accept as a fact that there are good values that most people don't accept in the mainstream, and that we need to still cooperate and live with those people. And if we try to sort of adopt these means of imposing those values upon them, they will become upset and they will react and they will elect the orange man. And this is a question of means, right? It's not a question of critiquing the values. I think they should be allowed to organize sub-communities around whatever values they like. So I guess that's what I would say about that, is that just sort of appease that kind of worry is, you say, self-organization is possible. And the outcome of trying to impose that value on a society-wide scale is not going to be the enactment of that value. It's going to be a reactionary movement against your attempt.
All right, great. So if there are more people with questions, can you raise your hand so I can see them? So I can see one individual right there in the center, please. I'm sorry, could you speak up a bit? It's very difficult to hear.
On the kind of general point that you talked about, obviously being type 1 talk, and liberalism sort of critique that, would you, I sort of thought when you were talking about how a lot of those sorts of concepts and that sort of imposition of this kind of civic narrative in society, a lot of that feels more so nowadays than ever perpetuated by media narratives and by social media in a way that it feels like escaping that is almost impossible, in a way that this sort of imposition, this constant dynamic is constantly perpetuated in a way that it doesn't feel very tangible to live. Do you think that adopting this kind of dynamism, sort of leaving that constant imposition, being able to accept wider reasons not going to be constantly in that sort of we can talk about, how realistic do you find that in our current contemporary situation with sort of these sorts of media narratives that are so common, where it does so strongly limit that?
Great. So if I understand the question correctly, you're worried about the effect of social media on seeking out points of consensus among diverse viewpoints, because social media tends to exacerbate polarization and drive people into divided communities where they're not sort of able to understand one another. Is that correct? Okay, yeah. Yeah, I think that I'm less concerned about polarization than a lot of people. I think polarization, as long as you're still sort of like in dialogue with one another and listening to one another and treating one another as people that are part of a society that you want to live in, polarization can be healthy. Disagreement, I have a kind of agonistic view in some sense of democracy. Polarization becomes pathological when people stop treating one another as human beings that are reasonable and just treat them as stupid and evil and completely sort of benighted or misinformed. That's when it really breaks down. And with social media, I guess what I'm concerned about is the fracturing of political groups onto different platforms. So I think it's quite possible that in a few years there won't be any Democrats left on X or Twitter. They'll all be on Blue Sky. This is a really bad development, right? Like, I think that if you're a liberal, you should stay on X and Twitter, and you should keep posting your liberal points and make sure that people who are not liberal are seeing them, because otherwise, like, the kind of polarization, the benefits that can accrue from polarization aren't going to, because the dialogue is going to cease. But if you accept that, like, confronting diverse viewpoints can be part of this beneficial dynamic process, then polarization isn't necessarily bad until polarized people stop recognizing one another as agents responding to reasons. That's when it really breaks down. Robert Talisse is a political philosopher at Vanderbilt. He's just finished a trilogy on democracy in which he really defends this idea that polarization on its own is not bad, that it can be good if it's not accompanied by these other pathologies. And he points out that it is unfortunately accompanied by certain pathologies like Democrats and Republicans in the United States don't even shop at the same stores. They apparently, like, there's very weird things, right? Like Republicans never carry tote bags, which is shocking to me, because tote bags are very useful. If you say Iraq instead of Iraq, I can tell whether you're a Democrat or a Republican. Like, very weird things, right? Which really signals that there's a kind of divergence in cultures that's beyond just polarization of opinion. And that's sort of the thing that I'm worried about, not the polarization of opinion per se.
All right, thank you very much. So it looks as though there are no more questions left. So let's, oh, right, okay, one last question. Very briefly, please.
Small hint, I mean, I just feel in the room, I mean, some of the contributors, this kind of denigration of the so-called populist right, and let's say the Reform Party or in Germany, the AfD, there's a kind of misconception which is actually part of this, let's say, ungenerous defamation, cancel culture kind of thing. So I just want to put that pointer on this. I mean, in these groups you would find a lot of defenders of classical liberalists and Hayek, and more sympathy with what you're saying, so I wouldn't make that contrast. I would certainly, you were kind of anti-woke, I felt, but you also make an effort to see the positive. Just throw this in there.
Yeah, I'm trying to make everyone mad.
That's a cultural aspect. Forget about it. That has to be uprooted, and then on a substantive issue we can discuss a lot. And somebody like, for instance, the book, The Identity Trap, would be a point of reference for me in that. But I want to put that pointer out. The populist right as illiberal is not necessarily correct in all its nuances. It's a bit of a smear.
Right, thank you. It's a diverse group. It's a diverse group. And I tried to mostly use the term authoritarian populist because there are authoritarian populists on the left as well, rather than right-wing populist. So, yeah.
All right, well, thank you all very much for the excellent questions, and thank you, Alex, for absolutely fascinating and stimulating talk. So let's thank our speaker one more time.